The gun was already pressed against Jane Covington's temple when Clement Bailey kicked open the door of the Rattlesnake Saloon, and the look on his face was not one of a man who had arrived in time. It was the look of a man who feared he had arrived too late, and who would burn the entire territory to ash if that were the case. "Let her go, Harlan." His voice carried the kind of quiet that was more dangerous than any shout, low and certain as a coming storm. "This ends now." Harlan Dusk, the self-appointed law of Caldwell Springs, pressed the barrel harder against Jane's cheek and smiled with all the warmth of a snake in January. He was a broad, thick-necked man whose badge caught the lamplight in a way that made it look like something rotten. "You walked away from this town once, Bailey. Should have kept on walking." Jane did not flinch. Her eyes found Clement's from across the smoky room, and in that exchange was everything two people could say without opening their mouths. She had not come this far, had not crossed half a continent with nothing but a carpetbag and a set of letters bound in twine, to die in a saloon that smelled of sawdust and broken promises. She had come to the frontier wearing her courage like a second skin, and she was not about to shed it now. "She doesn't belong here," Harlan said. "She came asking questions. Questions about you, Bailey, about your land, about what happened to her brother." Something flickered across Clement's face then, something that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but something occupying the hollow space between the two. His jaw tightened. His hand moved toward the revolver at his hip and then stopped. "Whatever you think you know," Clement said carefully, "you are pointing that gun at an innocent woman." "No innocent woman rides 3 days through Comanche territory alone," Harlan said. "No innocent woman walks into my town demanding to see a man's deed and his past in the same breath." Jane's voice came then, steady as river rock. "I am Jane Covington of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and if you pull that trigger, you will answer to every newspaper in the East within a month, because I was expected, and when I do not arrive, they will come looking." It was the finest bluff she had ever committed to in her life. The room held its breath. And Clement Bailey used that single second of Harlan Dusk's hesitation to cross the room in 4 strides, and drive his fist into the man's jaw with the full force of everything he had been holding back since the moment he'd read her first letter, 6 weeks ago, and understood that she was coming whether he answered her or not. She had come to the right country. It had begun, as most irreversible things did, with a letter. Jane Covington had received the telegram in early April of 1878, delivered to the small school where she taught reading and composition to the children of Philadelphia's working quarter. The telegram had come from a lawyer in Abilene, Kansas, informing her that her younger brother, Thomas Covington, had died the previous November under circumstances the lawyer described with careful vagueness as an accident related to a land dispute, and that his small homestead claim in the territory of southern Kansas had either been absorbed into a neighboring ranch or was in the process of being contested, the details of which were, the lawyer said, complicated. Jane had read the telegram 3 times. Then she had folded it, placed it inside her coat, finished the school day without so much as a tremor in her voice, walked home to her rented rooms, sat down at the kitchen table, and allowed herself exactly 1 hour of grief before she picked up a pen. Thomas had been 24 years old. He had gone west 3 years before, following a dream she had argued against with every logical faculty she possessed, because she was the older sister, and that was what older sisters did. He had written to her faithfully every 2 weeks, letters full of the kind of breathless wonder that the frontier seemed to produce in young men from the East, letters about the sky and the grass and the impossible silence, and the way the wind moved across open land like something alive. She had kept every letter. She had them still, tied with blue twine, in the bottom of her trunk. His last letter had been dated October of 1877. He had written that things were getting difficult with a neighbor named Dusk, that there was pressure on the small homesteaders in the Caldwell Springs area, that a man named Clement Bailey, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county, had been, Thomas wrote, the only one in the region who had not taken Dusk's money or his threats, and that Thomas respected that, even if Bailey was not an easy man to know. Jane had written that name down. Clement Bailey. She had sent a letter to the lawyer in Abilene and a letter to the land office, and a letter to a contact at the Kansas State Records Office who owed her a favor from when she had helped his daughter pass her letters examination. She had not written to Clement Bailey. Not yet. She had compiled information first because that was what she did. She was methodical. She was precise. She was, as her father had said, with a complicated mixture of pride and exasperation throughout her childhood, entirely too much of a mind for a woman of her time. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and she had decided before the April snow had fully melted that she was going to Kansas. The letter to Clement Bailey had come last, composed carefully over 3 drafts, and sent with the knowledge that he might not respond. She had told him plainly who she was, what she had learned, and that she intended to travel west to investigate the circumstances of her brother's death, regardless of any assistance he might or might not offer. She had mentioned Thomas by name. She had mentioned Harlan Dusk by name. She had asked Bailey, directly and without any social softening, whether he was willing to speak with her, and whether he could recommend lodging in Caldwell Springs that was both affordable and reasonably free of vermin, both the rodent kind and the human kind. Then she had booked a train ticket to Abilene for the 15th of May, packed a single large carpetbag and a modest trunk, arranged for her teaching position to be held by her colleague Mrs. Parris for the duration of the summer, and told her landlady, Mrs. Holloway, that she was going to Kansas and would be back by September if everything went as planned, and possibly not at all if it did not. Mrs. Holloway had said that Jane Covington was going to get herself killed, and that it was a terrible waste of a perfectly good schoolteacher. Jane had kissed her on the cheek and walked out the door. The train journey to Abilene took 4 days and consumed most of the money Jane had saved over the previous 3 years. She rode in the standard passenger cars, not the sleeper car, and she ate what she had packed in a cloth satchel, and she read, and she watched the landscape change outside the window as the ordered, dense world of the East gradually loosened and spread, and then simply opened up into something she had no adequate vocabulary for. It was not beautiful in any way she had been prepared to find beautiful. It was not the soft, cultivated beauty of the countryside outside Philadelphia, with its stone walls and elm trees and gentle hills. It was something rawer and larger than that, something that made her feel both very small and, unexpectedly, very free. She received Clement Bailey's response at the postal office in Abilene the morning after she arrived, which meant he had written it within a few days of receiving her letter, which surprised her. She had expected either silence or a terse dismissal. What she received instead was 2 full pages in a handwriting that was precise and slightly cramped, as though the writer was accustomed to conserving space. He wrote that he was sorry about her brother, and that he meant that, without the usual social formality people tended to apply to condolences. He wrote that Thomas Covington had been, in his brief observation, a man of genuine character who had been placed in an impossible situation, and had handled it with more dignity than most men 3 times his age. He wrote that the situation in Caldwell Springs was, as she had surmised, not simple, and that Harlan Dusk was a man of significant local power and significant local danger, and that her plan to arrive alone and investigate was either the bravest or the most inadvisable thing he had heard in recent memory, and possibly both simultaneously. He wrote that there was a boarding house run by a widow named Clara Fenn that was clean, reasonably priced, and safe, and he could vouch for Mrs. Fenn personally. He wrote that he would meet her on the main street of Caldwell Springs on the day she arrived, if she would send word ahead of her schedule. Then in the final paragraph he had written something that she read twice. He had written, "Miss Covington, the frontier is not what the Eastern papers and the dime novels describe it to be, but it is honest in a way that few places are. It breaks people and it builds them in equal measure. If you are coming here in grief, be prepared for it to ask something more of you before it gives you anything back. If you are coming here in courage, then you have come to the right country. She had folded the letter and put it with the others. The stagecoach from Abilene to Caldwell Springs ran twice a week, and Jane caught it on a Wednesday morning in late May. There were 3 other passengers, a cattle broker who smelled of tobacco and spoke without being asked, a quiet woman returning to her husband's farm who kept her eyes on her folded hands, and a young man who introduced himself as a surveyor for the railroad, and who spent the entire 8-hour journey talking about grade elevations with the cattle broker. Jane watched the country pass and tried to hold onto the feeling she had cultivated carefully during the train journey, the feeling of being sufficient to whatever came next. It was not easy to maintain through 3 days of rough road, a broken wheel that cost them 4 hours outside a creek crossing, a thunderstorm that turned the track to mud and made the horses miserable, and one night spent at a way station that was less a building and more an optimistic arrangement of boards and determination. Caldwell Springs announced itself gradually, first as a smudge of wood smoke against the enormous sky, then as the outline of buildings becoming more specific as the coach rolled down a road that had settled into something resembling an actual road only in the last quarter mile. It was not an impressive town by any measure she could apply. There was a main street of about 8 buildings, a handful of side streets with homes and smaller structures, a livery stable, a church with a crooked cross, a land office, a general store, a saloon called the Rattlesnake, a barbershop, and the sheriff's office which bore the name H. Dusk, sheriff in letters that had been painted with a confidence that Jane found immediately suspect. She stepped down from the coach, straightened her hat, and looked at the man who was waiting. He was leaning against the post of the general store with the unhurried ease of someone who had nowhere pressing to be, and no intention of performing impatience for anyone's benefit. He was taller than she had imagined, with wide shoulders and hands that spoke of outdoor work, and he was perhaps 30 years old or a little past it, with a dark, close-trimmed beard and eyes that were doing what she would come to recognize as their habitual thing, which was observing everything in the immediate vicinity with a quality of attention that was not hostile but was absolutely complete. He was not wearing a gun on his hip. She noticed that. He was wearing work clothes, not the dramatic wide-brimmed hat and silver-studded vest of the dime novels, but practical boots and a plain coat, and a hat that had been worn to exactly the shape he needed it to be. He straightened when she stepped down, and he walked toward her without hesitation or theater, and he said, "Miss Covington." "Mr. Bailey," she said. "You made it," he said. "I did," she said. There was a brief silence in which they appeared to be taking accurate inventory of each other. She was 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back severely and gray eyes that her students had described, with the pitiless honesty of children, as the kind of eyes that always knew when you hadn't done the reading. She was wearing a gray traveling dress that had been fine once and was now worn at the cuffs, and she was carrying her carpet bag, and her expression was the one she used when she was being tested and refusing to let the test see that she felt it. "You look like your brother," Clement Bailey said, "around the eyes." She had not expected that, and it cost her a moment before she could speak again. "People have said so," she managed. He reached and took her carpet bag without asking permission, which she noted and decided not to object to. "I'll take you to Mrs. Fenn's. Your trunk will come with the other luggage and I'll have it brought over." He paused. "I should tell you before we walk 3 feet further down this street that Harlan Dusk has likely already been told you arrived. He has eyes everywhere in this town. Walking with me will not make things simpler for you." "Nothing about this is going to be simple," Jane said. "No," Clement Bailey agreed. "But I meant what I wrote. You've come to the right country for it." He said it without elaboration, as though it were a plain fact rather than a reassurance, and somehow that was more comforting than anything ornate might have been. They walked to Mrs. Fenn's boarding house, and people watched them from windows and doorways, and Harlan Dusk watched them from the porch of his office with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. And Jane looked neither left nor right but straight ahead, and her back was very straight. Clara Fenn was a small, vigorous woman of about 50, with the kind of face that had been shaped by years of practical decision-making and the occasional sorrow. She greeted Jane with genuine warmth, showed her to a room on the second floor that was small and clean and had a window facing east, and told her that breakfast was at 7 and supper at 6, and that she was not responsible for what happened if someone was late to either. She looked at Clement with an expression of careful analysis and said, "You are not leaving her here without explaining what's happening, Clement Bailey." And he said, "No, Clara, I am not." And she nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose standards had been momentarily in doubt but had been confirmed after all. They sat in Mrs. Fenn's front parlor that evening, Clara present as propriety required, while Clement explained what had happened to Thomas Covington. He spoke carefully and without evasion, which Jane found, in retrospect, to be the quality that she came to trust first in him and most deeply. He was not a man who softened things for the comfort of the recipient, but he was also not a man who delivered hard truths without understanding that he was handling something that mattered. He had, he said, a habit of honesty that sometimes made him unpopular. Jane said she understood. She had the same habit. Thomas, Clement told her, had taken a homestead claim on 160 acres south of town under the Homestead Act, as several other young men had done in the previous years. The land was good land, river-fed and flat, the kind of land that a man with patience and hard work could make something of. But Harlan Dusk, who had come to the area 5 years earlier and had systematically positioned himself as the town's sheriff through means that Clement described as deeply suspect and that Clara Fenn described as criminal, had been acquiring land. Not legally. He was pressuring homesteaders to sell at insultingly low prices, and when they refused, he was finding ways to make life very difficult for them, and in some cases, he was going further than difficult. Thomas had refused to sell. In November, a fence had been cut on Thomas's property, and his cattle had scattered across the prairie. While Thomas was out in the dark trying to collect them, his horse had stumbled in a ravine. The fall had killed him. Clement paused at that point and let the silence exist for a moment. Was it an accident? Jane asked. Clement was quiet for a moment. That was in itself an answer. The fence was cut deliberately. Whether someone drove him out there that night, whether someone spooked the horse, I cannot prove. What I know is that Dusk had been threatening Thomas for 2 months prior, and that the week before Thomas died, Thomas had written to the county land office objecting to an irregularity in a neighboring claim that Dusk had filed. Jane felt the cold of it move through her like water. He had evidence. I think he did. I think the letter he sent may have caused Dusk to act. But I cannot prove that either, not yet. The letter Thomas sent to the land office, Jane said. Is there a record of it? Clement looked at her with something that adjusted slightly in his expression, a recalibration she could not entirely read. You are thinking like an investigator. I am thinking like a woman whose brother is dead and whose brother's land is now in the possession of the man who may have killed him, Jane said evenly. I am thinking like someone who needs evidence that will hold in a court of law because I have no intention of addressing this through any other means. You've already been thinking through this for weeks, Clement said. Since April, she confirmed. He was quiet again, and this time the quality of his quiet was different from the previous one. It was the quiet of someone updating their understanding of something significant. The land records are in the county seat at Wichita, he said. And I know a man at the county recorder's office who is not in Dusk's pocket because Dusk has not managed to reach Wichita yet. I also know that Thomas kept a journal. I found it in his house before Dusk's men cleared the property. I have it. Jane went very still. You have his journal, she said. I was not going to send it in a letter. I wanted to give it to you myself. He reached inside his coat and produced a slim, battered book with a dark cover, and he held it across to her, and Jane took it with both hands and held it, and for a moment the room was very quiet. Clara Finn, who had been sitting with her sewing and very carefully not appearing to listen, found something to examine on the ceiling. Jane held the journal and breathed and did not open it, not yet. "Thank you," she said, in a voice that was entirely ordinary except for what it cost her to make it so. "He talked about you often," Clement said, "in the ways a younger brother talks about someone he is trying not to need and cannot manage it." She did not have an answer for that. The journal became the center of the next 2 weeks. Jane read it carefully, beginning to end, twice, and then she began to compile a timeline. Thomas had been meticulous, in the way that people who are uncertain of their safety sometimes become meticulous, as though documentation were a form of protection. He had recorded dates and conversations and threats and witnesses. He had named names. He had described, in careful detail, an encounter with Dusk's foreman in which the foreman had told him, in terms that stopped just short of being legally actionable, what would happen if Thomas did not sign a bill of sale. He had also recorded something else. He had recorded a conversation with Clement Bailey on the 5th of October, 1877, 6 weeks before his death, in which Bailey had offered Thomas the use of his lawyer in Wichita if he decided to contest Dusk's boundary claims. Thomas had written, "Bailey is not a warm man, and I don't think he was the kind to make offers like this easily, so I take it seriously. He seems to be the only person in this county who is not afraid of Dusk, and I asked him once why that was. He said some people's secrets are bigger than anything anyone can threaten them with, and when that's the case, threats lose their purchase. I didn't fully understand him, but I wrote it down because it seemed important." Jane had looked at that sentence for a long time. Some people's secrets are bigger than anything anyone can threaten them with. She had begun, by that point, to spend a portion of each day in Clement Bailey's company, which was not something she had planned and not something she had resisted, because it was practically useful, and she was a practical woman, and she told herself those two things regularly enough that they felt almost entirely true. He was helping her document the land dispute. He had taken her to meet the ranchers and homesteaders who had been pressured by Dusk and who were willing to speak. And there were more of them than she had expected, 8 families and 3 single men who had all faced some form of coercion, and who had, in many cases, been too afraid to speak, until she arrived and showed them that someone from outside the county was paying attention and had the tools to make that attention matter. She was teaching one of the homesteaders' children to read in exchange for meals on 3 evenings a week, because her money was running low and she would not take charity, and word of this spread through Caldwell Springs in the way that all information spread in small western towns, instantaneously and with elaboration. Clement had said, the 3rd time he came to collect her for an interview with a reluctant witness, "You have made yourself part of this town in 2 weeks." "I have made myself useful," she corrected. "That is different. In this part of the country," he said, "they are the same thing." She learned things about him in segments, the way you learn the shape of a room by moving through it in the dark, one careful step at a time. She learned that he had come west from Georgia in 1867, at the age of 19, which made him 30 years old now, 4 years older than she was. She learned that his family had lost everything in the war and its aftermath, that he had come west with little more than his ability to work, and a determination not to be broken by what had broken his father. She learned that he had built the Bailey Ranch from a small initial claim into what was now one of the most productive cattle operations in the county, not through the methods that men like Dusk employed, but through consistent, grueling, patient work, and the ability to make and keep agreements with the Cheyenne and other nations whose territory the land had been before it was anyone's ranch, agreements based on mutual respect that had kept his northern boundaries safe when others had not been. She learned that he could read legal documents with the fluency of a man who had taught himself law from borrowed books, because he could not afford to hire lawyers in his early years. She learned that he had a scar along his left forearm from a branding iron incident. He described with such spare brevity that she knew it had been far worse than the description suggested. She learned that he drank coffee in a volume that she found both impressive and slightly alarming, that he was deeply, quietly religious in a way that had nothing to do with church attendance, and that he had, at some point in the past, been engaged to marry a woman who had died of fever before the wedding, and that this fact lived in him in the quiet way of old losses that have been accepted but not dissolved. She learned, without any of this being said aloud, that he was a man she could not stop thinking about, and that this was a complication she had not factored into her plans. She told herself to focus. She had more immediate problems. Harlan Dusk had not been idle since her arrival. He had sent 2 of his deputies to Mrs. Fenn's boarding house under the pretext of verifying that she was who she claimed to be, which was a transparent fiction, and Jane had received them in the parlor and answered their questions with a cheerful cooperativeness that was so complete and so devoid of anything useful that they had left looking vaguely confused. Dusk had then arranged for the postmaster, a nervous little man named Garrett, to intercept her outgoing mail, which she discovered when a letter she had sent to her contact at the county record's office in Wichita came back to her unopened with a note saying it had been missent. She recognized the interference for what it was. She told Clement about the mail the same afternoon. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I ride to Wichita on business once a month. I am due to go next week. I can carry letters for you." "That would make you a target," she said. "Dusk has been making me a target for 3 years, Clement said. "He wants my land. He has not managed to pressure me because I have no debt and no leverage, and because I have, over time, made myself too useful to too many people in this county for him to simply eliminate. But he would like to. The difference is that now you are here and you are building a case that could reach past the county line, and that changes his calculation." "I am putting you in greater danger," Jane said. "You are giving me an ally," Clement said. "It is not the same thing." They looked at each other in the way that they had begun to look at each other when they had run out of practical things to say, the way that contained something neither of them had named yet, something that was growing in the space between the practical and the personal with the quiet, inevitable force of something that has decided to exist regardless of the opinions of the people involved. "You should know," Clement said carefully, "that Dusk will use any weapon available to him. If he comes to believe that you and I are more than investigative allies, he will use that too." "Are we?" Jane asked. The question surprised her as much as it appeared to surprise him. She had not entirely meant to say it aloud. Clement Bailey looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window of Mrs. Fenn's parlor at an angle that made the dust motes in the air look like they were hovering in decision. "I think," he said finally, "that we are getting there." She did not know what to do with that. She filed it away and thought about it later that night in her small east-facing room, while the plains wind moved against the window glass and the town settled into its nighttime quiet. And she was honest enough with herself to admit that getting there was precisely where she was going to. The ride to Wichita was 5 days there and 5 days back, which meant that Clement was going to be gone for 10 days, and Jane spent the first 3 of those days working so hard that Mrs. Fenn suggested she stop before she made herself ill, and the next 4 days working slightly less hard, and additionally being aware of how large the town felt without him in it. She interviewed 2 more witnesses. She made a careful map of the land claims in dispute. She obtained, through a contact that one of the homesteader wives had in the land office, a copy of the survey notes from Thomas's original claim, and she compared them to what she knew of Dusk's subsequent filing, and she found a discrepancy that was not large but was not innocent. She wrote all of this up in meticulous longhand. She also, during those 10 days, became properly acquainted with the town and its people, and in doing so she understood something important about the kind of injustice Harlan Dusk represented. It was not spectacular. It was slow and grinding and personal. It was the kind of injustice that happened to people who were too isolated to attract attention, too poor to hire help, and too tired from the work of surviving to mount a sustained resistance. The homesteaders who had sold to dusk had not done so because they were weak. They had done so because they were alone. She thought about that in connection with Thomas, about what it must have been like for him to face it at 24, and she thought about the letter Clement had described, the one Thomas had sent to the land office, the one that had perhaps precipitated everything. Thomas had not been weak either. He had done the right thing. He had documented and reported and tried to engage the system that was supposed to protect him. The system had not protected him. She had been in enough classrooms with enough children from difficult homes to understand that the gap between what systems were supposed to do and what they actually did was not an abstraction. It was where people lived and died. On the 8th day, Dusk himself came to Mrs. Fenn's boarding house. Jane had been expecting it. She greeted him in the parlor with a cup of tea and offered him one, which he declined with the irritated gesture of a man who was not accustomed to having his menace neutralized by domestic courtesy. He was a large man up close, with a face that had been handsome once and had settled into something harder, and the kind of physical confidence that comes from years of having people make way for him. He told her, with the surface manner of a concerned civic official, that he had heard she was asking questions about a land dispute, and that he wanted to make sure she understood that the matter had been fully resolved through proper legal channels, and that her brother's death, while tragic, had been a clear accident with no suspicious circumstances. He told her that Caldwell Springs was a friendly town, and he hoped she was finding it so. He told her that he would be happy to show her the relevant documentation. Jane sipped her tea. She told him, with the surface manner of a grateful visitor, that she was simply a schoolteacher paying her respects to the place where her brother had lived, that she found Caldwell Springs delightful, and that she would certainly appreciate seeing any documentation that might help her understand the circumstances. She asked him what documentation specifically he had in mind. He mentioned the sale of Thomas's claim. She said she would be very interested to see that, since a valid sale required Thomas's signature, and Thomas had not mentioned any sale in any of his correspondence, and she was quite sure a man with his apparent thoroughness had access to the original document. Something crossed Dusk's face that was quick and cold and then was gone again. He stood up. He said that he hoped she enjoyed her stay and that the weather could be unpredictable this time of year. She said that she had always found unpredictable weather bracing. After he left, Clara Fenn appeared from the kitchen where she had been determinedly not listening and put both hands on Jane's shoulders and said, "Jane Covington, you are either the bravest woman I have ever met or the most reckless one, and I cannot decide which." Jane said that, in her experience, the two were very difficult to separate. Clement returned on the 10th day, coming into town in the late afternoon on a gray horse that was dusty from the road, and he came directly to Mrs. Fenn's. And the thing that happened when Jane looked up from the table where she had been working and saw him standing in the doorway was something she did not try to analyze or contain. She simply stood up and said his name. He had brought letters, actual letters, delivered by his hand to the county recorder in Wichita, who had confirmed the irregularity in Dusk's claim filing, and who had agreed to provide a formal statement. He had also brought a copy of a registered deed that contradicted Dusk's ownership assertion on the land adjacent to Thomas's original claim, meaning that the land Dusk was currently occupying and operating could not legally belong to him. More than that, he had found the record of Thomas's letter to the land office. The original letter was on file. It had been received, logged, and then appeared to have been misfiled in a way that the clerk described, when Clement pressed him, as unusual and inconsistent with normal procedure. The clerk was willing to testify to that. They sat at Mrs. Fenn's kitchen table with Clara hovering nearby offering coffee every 20 minutes as an expression of emotional support, and they spread the documents out, and Jane looked at what they had and understood that they had enough to proceed. "We need to send this to the state attorney's office," she said. "Yes," Clement agreed. "Dusk came to see me while you were gone," Jane said. Clement's expression did not change, but something went very quiet in him, the specific quality of quiet that she had learned to read as the one that meant he was controlling something with effort. "Tell me," she told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his qualities that she had come to find remarkable, the ability to listen with his whole attention without needing to fill any of the space. When she finished, he said, "He is going to escalate." "I know, Jane." He said her name in a way that was different from how he had been saying it, and she looked at him directly, which was also something she had learned to do with him in a way she had not been able to initially because his attention was very dense and she had needed to build a certain steadiness to meet it. "What I am about to say is not intended to stop you from what you are doing. I want to be clear about that before I say it." "Say it," she said. "I am afraid for you," he said. Not in the way that men are sometimes afraid for women, because they believe women cannot manage themselves. In the way that I am afraid for someone specific whose safety matters to me in a way that has become personal and that I cannot pretend is only professional. The kitchen was very warm. "Say what you mean," she said, because she needed to hear it said plainly. "I mean," Clement Bailey said, "that somewhere in the past 3 weeks I have gone from being the man who received an extraordinary letter from a determined stranger to being a man who is trying very hard not to tell that same woman, before he has any right to. That the prospect of Harlan Dusk pointing anything at her makes me want to do something that I would consider a significant departure from my normal character." Clara Finn put down her coffee pot and found a reason to go into the other room. Jane said, "You have been honest with me from the beginning, so I will be honest with you. I came here for Thomas. I came here because I was grieving and angry and I needed to do something with both of those things, and I was afraid, if I am being absolutely truthful with you, that if I did not come I would spend the rest of my life in that schoolroom wondering what had happened to him and knowing that I had been too cautious to find out. I did not come here looking for anything else." She paused. "And yet," she said. "And yet," he said. They sat with that for a moment. "I need to finish what I came here to do," she said, "before anything else." "Yes," he said, "and I am going to help you finish it. And after that, if you are willing, I would like very much to talk about the and yet." She looked at him, and she thought about all the reasons this was complicated, and all the distances involved, and all the ways her life was arranged elsewhere. And she thought about the letter he had written her, the one where he had said she had come to the right country. And she thought about the way she had felt when he walked in the doorway after 10 days. And she thought about Thomas, who had found something worth believing in out here on the open plains, and who would have laughed at her for arguing too long against the obvious. "All right," she said. The escalation came on a Thursday. Jane had ridden out to the property that had been Thomas's, with Clement on his gray horse and the documents in her saddlebag, intending to photograph the boundary markers with a small camera she had borrowed from the surveyor who was still in town. The property looked different in the late spring light than she had imagined it from Thomas's letters. The small cabin he had built was still standing, though it had been emptied. The creek he had written about was running well, glinting through the cottonwoods, and she could see why he had loved it. She stood at the edge of what had been his claim and held herself very still and let herself feel the full weight of missing him, not the controlled grief she had been living with since April, but the real thing, the bottomless, ordinary fact of someone who had existed fully and then had simply ceased to. And she was glad that Clement was there, because he did not try to speak or to comfort her with words. He simply stood near enough that she was not alone, and that was what she needed. Then the sound of approaching horses came from the south, and it was not one horse but 4, and when they appeared over the rise she recognized Dusk's foreman, a heavy man named Cutter, and 3 of the men she had seen around Dusk's operation. They were not there to talk. Cutter told them to leave the property, which he said was legally Dusk's. Clement said, with the precise steadiness of a man who has thought through a great many possible confrontations and arrived at this one prepared, that the legality of that claim was currently under investigation by the county recorder's office and the state attorney, and that he would be happy to provide documentation if Cutter was interested. Cutter said he was not interested in documentation. He said that Clement had been a thorn in Dusk's side long enough, and that the Eastern woman should have stayed where she came from. What happened next was a thing that Jane reconstructed carefully afterward, because it happened fast. One of Dusk's men reached for his gun, and Clement moved, and the manner in which he moved told her several things simultaneously about who he was and what his history contained that she had not yet been told. He was fast and he was trained, and he was not a man who had only ever worked cattle, but whatever his history was, he did not draw a weapon. He did not need to, because the action he took was not the kind that required one, and within a very few seconds 2 of the 4 men were on the ground and Cutter was backing his horse, and the 4th man had decided that his employment had certain limits. Cutter said, from what was now a more respectful distance, that this was not finished. Clement said he knew. They rode back to town quickly, and Clement took her to Mrs. Fenn's and then went directly to send a telegram to Wichita. Jane had photographed the boundary markers with shaking hands before the confrontation, and the photographs were good. That night, lying awake in her east-facing room, she thought about the way Clement had moved, and she thought about what Thomas had written, that some people's secrets are bigger than anything anyone can threaten them with. She had not asked him about it yet. She thought that, when the time came, he would tell her. She was right. It was 2 days later, on a quiet evening when they were walking along the edge of town, and the sky was doing the extraordinary thing that the Kansas sky did at that hour, pouring gold and pink and violet across more space than the eye could quite process. And Clement said without preamble that he had something to tell her. He had been a soldier. That part she had deduced. He had fought in the war, on the Confederate side, because he was from Georgia and had been 17 and had gone because his father sent him, and he had not yet developed the part of himself that questioned. He had fought for 2 years and had seen things that he described with a brevity that made the weight of them clear without requiring detail. At the end of the war, he had done something that had saved 4 men's lives at the cost of going against a direct order from an officer he knew to be both corrupt and cruel. An officer who had been planning to do something to a family of freed people, sheltering near their position, that Clement had refused to allow. The officer had filed charges. The charges had followed him for years, not legally actionable charges but reputational ones. The dark past that men like Dusk could have used if they had known about it. And Dusk had tried to find something on Clement Bailey for 3 years, and had not found this particular thing because Clement had changed his route coming west, and had come through different territory than a Georgia man might naturally travel, and he had simply not been found. The men he had saved had scattered to different states. The officer who had filed the charges had died of a fever in 1869. He was not telling her this because he was afraid of it. He was telling her because he did not want to be with her and yet while carrying a secret from her. Jane listened to all of it, and then she said, "What you did for those 4 men and that family, do you consider that the right thing?" "I do," he said. "Then that is the only part that matters to me," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him. The sky behind him was the color of something inexhaustible. "Jane," he said, and then he stopped, because he was not a man who said things before he was certain of them. "I know," she said. He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had touched her with intention, and it was so simple and so significant that she felt it all the way through. "After this is done," he said. "After this is done," she agreed. The crisis came the following Tuesday. Jane had gone to the Rattlesnake Saloon to speak with the barman, a man named Willis who had been present when Dusk had threatened Thomas, and who had not yet been willing to provide a statement but who had, through Clara Fenn's network, sent word that he might be ready to talk. She had not told Clement about this meeting because she knew he would come, and she needed Willis to feel that he was speaking with her alone, without the complication of Clement Bailey's presence, which in this town carried its own freight of complicated meaning. She had gone in the late afternoon when the saloon was quiet, and Willis had been there, and he had been ready to talk, and she had just finished writing his account in her notebook when the door opened, and Harlan Dusk walked in with two of his men, and the gun was pressed against her temple before she had fully understood what was happening, which was where the story had started, and which brought her back to the Rattlesnake saloon floor, to Clement Bailey standing over the crumpled form of Harlan Dusk, to her own hands shaking with the first real fear she had allowed herself, to Willis the barman standing behind the counter with his mouth open, to the two deputies who were pressed against the wall looking at Clement with the expression of men rapidly recalculating their commitments. Clement turned to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and the way he asked it was the way you ask when the answer is the most important thing you have ever waited for. "No," she said. He crossed to her in 2 steps and took her face in both his hands, his thumbs on her cheekbones, and he looked at her the way you look at someone when you have just learned with your whole body what it means to be afraid of losing them. "I told you not to go anywhere without telling me," he said, and his voice was rough. "You never said that," she said. "I should have," he said. "I am all right," she said. "I know," he said. "I can see that. You are also the most terrifying person I have met in 30 years on this earth." She laughed at that, a short, shaken sound, and he pulled her in and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed, and the whole terrible tension of the past hour released all at once, and she was, for a moment, simply a woman who was very relieved to be held. Dusk was not unconscious. He was sitting on the floor holding his jaw and looking at Clement with an expression that had lost all of its performance and showed something underneath it that was neither comfortable nor simple. He said with some difficulty that this was not over. Clement said, still holding Jane, that the telegram to the state attorney's office had been sent 4 days ago, that a deputy from Wichita was expected within the week, that the county recorder's testimony was on record, that Thomas Covington's journal had been copied twice with 1 copy sent to Jane's contact in Philadelphia, and that Willis the barman had in the past 20 minutes provided a signed statement. Dusk was quiet. "You are finished in this county," Clement said, not with satisfaction but with the flat certainty of a man stating something that is simply true. "Whatever you do tonight will only make the charges more serious." Willis, from behind the bar, said that he was going to go get the deputy who was not one of Dusk's men, and he went. The deputy who was not one of Dusk's men was a young fellow named Reed who had been quietly miserable in his employment for 2 years, and who, upon arriving at the Rattlesnake and taking in the situation, said that he was formally placing Sheriff Dusk in custody pending the arrival of the state's deputy, and that he was doing this with the full weight of law enforcement authority, which he was aware was somewhat technical under the circumstances, but which he intended to take seriously. Harlan Dusk allowed himself to be placed in custody with the expression of a man who is calculating and has not finished calculating, but who understands that the calculation is no longer running in his favor. The state's deputy arrived on a Friday, 6 days later, on a stagecoach that also carried a letter for Jane from the state attorney's office acknowledging receipt of her documentation and indicating that an investigation into the land irregularities and the circumstances of Thomas Covington's death had been formally opened. It was not justice completed. It would take months, a year, possibly more, for the formal proceedings to work through whatever process they would work through. But it was the system engaging for once on behalf of the right people, and Jane stood on the main street of Caldwell Springs and held the letter and felt Thomas with her in the particular way of the dead who have been done right by, a presence rather than an absence, warm and quiet. Clement stood beside her. "It is not finished," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it is started." She looked up at him. "I have to go back to Philadelphia." Something moved in his face and was controlled. "I know." "My position, My responsibilities. Mrs. Holloway will be going out of her mind." "I know," he said again. "I said I would be back by September if things went as planned," she said. "Things went considerably better than planned," he said carefully. "They did," she agreed. "Jane." He said her name with the full weight of the and yet and everything else that had been accumulating since the afternoon she had stepped off a stagecoach and he had said she had made it and she had said she had. "I have a teaching position," she said, "and a life in Philadelphia. I am a practical woman." "You are the most practical woman I have ever met," he said, "and you crossed half a continent alone to find out what happened to your brother, and you walked into Harlan Dusk's direct threats without flinching once, and you are standing here in the middle of the Kansas plains looking at me like you are calculating the distance." "I am calculating the distance," she said. "It is not uncrossable," he said. "I crossed it once," she said. "Yes," he said. They stood on the main street of Caldwell Springs, Kansas, in the late afternoon of a June day in 1878, and the sky was doing its enormous quiet thing, and Clement Bailey said, "Tell me what you need from me." Jane Covington looked at him and thought about Thomas, who had written that this country was honest in a way that few places were, and about the letter that had said she had come to the right country, and about the and yet that had been growing since the first day, and that was, she understood now, not a complication but the truest thing. "Write to me," she said. "Write to me honestly and often, and I will write back the same way, and we will see what becomes of it." "All right," he said. "And in the meantime," she said, "there is something I have been wanting to do since approximately the third day I was in this town." She stepped toward him, and she put her hand against the side of his face, and she kissed him, there on the main street of Caldwell Springs, which was scandalous and entirely right, and he kissed her back with the full, restrained honesty of a man who has been waiting very carefully for permission and is now using it. It was Clara Finn who broke them apart, not with disapproval but with a firm and cheerful announcement that supper was in 20 minutes, and that whatever they were doing could continue at a more appropriate time. Jane laughed and felt the weight of the past 2 months lift slightly, not go away, but settle into something she could carry differently. She left Caldwell Springs on a Tuesday in early July, on the morning stagecoach to Abilene, with her trunk on top and her carpetbag on her knee, and every document she had compiled in a separate leather case that Clement had bought for her at the general store, and presented without ceremony by simply handing it to her. She shook Clara Finn's hand and was pulled into a hug that she returned firmly. She shook Willis, the barman's hand, who was now comporting himself with the dignity of a man who has recently done the right thing for the first time in years. She shook young Deputy Reed's hand. She nodded to several of the homesteader families who had come to see her off. Clement put her trunk on the coach. He helped her up the step. He held her hand for a moment. "I will write," he said. "I know you will," she said. "You are a man who keeps his word." She released his hand and sat down, and the coach started, and she looked out the window as Caldwell Springs diminished behind her, and she held on to everything that it had given her and everything it had cost her and did not look away until it was gone. The letters began arriving in Philadelphia in August. They were, as promised, honest and frequent, arriving every week or sometimes less than that, long letters in that precise, slightly cramped handwriting that she had learned to recognize from across a room. He wrote about the ranch and its operations, the cattle drives to the railhead at Dodge City, the negotiations with the Cheyenne along the northern boundary that were delicate and required the kind of patience that he described with a respect for the complexity of those relationships that she found consistently striking. He wrote about Caldwell Springs, about the aftermath of Dusk's arrest, and the slow, grinding process of the legal proceedings, about the homesteaders who were beginning, carefully, to rebuild. He wrote about Deputy Reed, who had been appointed acting sheriff, and who was performing the role with a thoroughness that surprised everyone who had underestimated him. He wrote occasionally about himself, about what he was reading, about a question in philosophy or theology that had occupied him, about the way the land looked in different weather, about memories and their shapes. He wrote to her about Thomas sometimes. He told her things he remembered, small things, a particular joke Thomas had made, a conversation about the stars, the way Thomas had approached an unfamiliar task with the exact same quality of absolute refusal to be defeated that Clement had seen in her the first day she arrived. And she read those parts carefully and set them aside in a place inside herself that she was learning to tend. She wrote back. She wrote about her students and the particular satisfactions and frustrations of teaching. She wrote about Philadelphia and the way the city felt smaller and more complicated after the planes. She wrote about the investigation's progress because her contact at the state attorney's office was keeping her informed, and the case against Dusk was building slowly, but with the kind of solidity that suggested it would hold. She wrote about what she was thinking and reading and feeling, with the same honesty she used for everything else, because he had told her the frontier was honest, and she had decided to meet it that way. She wrote, in October, a letter that took her 4 drafts, in which she said that she was aware that she had a good life in Philadelphia, and that she was also aware, with increasing clarity, that something essential was missing from it that had not been missing before June of 1878, that she had been practical her whole life, and that she continued to believe that practicality was a virtue, but that she was beginning to think there was a difference between practical decisions and merely cautious ones. That she was going to resign her teaching position at the end of the school year in June. She did not say that she was coming back to Kansas. She did not need to. His response arrived in 12 days. He wrote, "I had the east-facing bedroom in the ranch house repainted in the autumn. It catches the morning light well. I thought you should know." She read that letter 3 times. She wrote back, "I have always been partial to morning light." She resigned her teaching position in March with 3 months' notice, which was more than was required, and which her principal accepted with the kind of complicated grace of someone who respects a decision while mourning its consequences. Mrs. Holloway wept and then made a substantial lunch, and said that she had known in May of 1878 that Jane Covington was not coming back from Kansas in September, and that she had simply been waiting for Jane to know it too. Jane packed her life. The large trunk, the carpet-bag, the books, the papers, the blue-wine-bound bundle of Thomas's letters. She said her goodbyes. She took the train west in June of 1879. She arrived in Abilene on a Thursday, and Clement was there, not leaning against a post this time, but standing on the platform with the full, still attention of a man who has been counting days, and is not going to pretend otherwise. He looked the same and also different in the way that a person looks different when you have known them for a year through letters and are now recalibrating the 3-dimensional version. She stepped onto the platform and he came to her without theater and took both her hands and looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You are back." "I told you I would be," she said. "You are back differently," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He brought her carpetbag without asking, as he had the first time, and she let him, and they walked through Abilene to where his horse and a second horse he had brought for her were waiting, and the ride to Caldwell Springs was 3 days, which was different from the stagecoach and better, because they were alone with the land and they talked, really talked, the way you can when you have been talking honestly through letters for a year, and the in-person version is simply a continuation of the same conversation. She learned more of him on those 3 days. She told him more of herself. They argued once about a question of law, and both of them enjoyed it in the way that people enjoy arguing when they are both confident and equally matched, which was rare, and which they recognized as something to be careful with. They laughed more than she had expected. He had a dry, understated humor that she found consistently delightful, and she had a quick, precise wit that he had noted in her letters, and was now noting in person with what appeared to be approval. They camped at night with appropriate propriety, which in practice meant that they stayed up too late talking by a fire, and then slept at a sensible distance from each other, and that both of these things were entirely honest expressions of where they were. Caldwell Springs had changed in the year she had been gone, not dramatically, but visibly. There was a new building on the main street, a proper hotel being constructed with the optimism of a town that has recently expelled its most corrupting element. Deputy Reed had been formally appointed sheriff by the county and was performing the role with the steady, modest competence that suited him. Two of the homesteader families had expanded their operations. One had added a daughter, one had added a son. The school, which had previously had no teacher, had one now, a young woman from Missouri named Miss Abbott who was doing her best with limited resources. Harlan Dusk had been convicted in March 1879 in Wichita on charges of land fraud and coercion, with a separate investigation ongoing into the circumstances of Thomas Covington's death, the outcome of which was not yet determined, but which the state attorney's office had told Jane, in a formal letter, was being pursued seriously. He had been sentenced to 7 years in the state penitentiary. The land he had fraudulently acquired was in the process of being returned to its original claimants or their estates. Thomas's land came to Jane. She rode out to it one afternoon in her first week back, alone this time, and she walked the creek line and stood in the doorway of the small cabin he had built, and she spoke to him in the quiet way that people speak to those they have lost when they are in the last place that still holds the shape of them. She told him what had happened, all of it, because he deserved to know. She told him about Clement, too, and about how it had started and where it seemed to be going, and she thought, in the honest, irrational way of grief, that he would have liked that very much. She walked back to the Bailey ranch in the late afternoon. Clement had supper ready, which was not a simple thing since he was, by his own honest assessment, a functional but uninspired cook, and the effort was visible in the results, which were edible if not remarkable. She told him it was good. He told her it was not, but thank you. They ate at the ranch house kitchen table, and the conversation moved the way conversations move when they are entirely comfortable, which is to say wherever they want, without effort. After supper, he took her out to the porch and the sky was doing what it did, the enormous extravagant evening performance, and they sat and watched it without the need to narrate it. He said after a while, "I have something I want to ask you." She said, "All right." He turned to face her, and he was not a man who was comfortable with elaborate performance, and so he did it simply. He said that he had spent his life building something that had always felt slightly incomplete, not because it was lacking anything material, but because he had understood in the past year what it was missing, which was her. He said that he knew she had come here for Thomas and had found something else as well, and he did not want to assume what she intended to do with that something else, but that he wanted her to know what he intended if she was willing. He said he was asking her to marry him, not because it was practical or logical, though he believed it was both, but because she was the most remarkable person he had ever met, and the world was too uncertain for him to waste time being cautious about the remarkable. She looked at him. She thought about the letter, the one that had said she had come to the right country. She thought about a woman who had packed a carpetbag and boarded a westbound train wearing her grief and her determination, and had arrived to find something she had not been looking for, and that turned out to be the truest thing. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He smiled, which was the full version of his smile that was not always available, and it made him look younger and lighter, and she reached across and took his hand and held it, and the sky was enormous and full of everything the sky ever was. They were married in September of 1879, in the small Caldwell Springs church with the crooked cross, which had been straightened for the occasion by Deputy Reed with the focused determination of a man doing something he felt strongly about. Clara Fenn organized everything that required organizing, and did so with the competence of a general and the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for this specific event for well over a year. The homesteader families came, and Willis the barman came, and the surveyor from the railroad, who had been back through on a survey and happened to be in town, came. Miss Abbott the schoolteacher came with the children, who were unruly and completely delightful. Jane wore a dress that was not gray, for the first time in recent memory. It was a deep blue, the color of the sky an hour after sunset, and she had made it herself over the previous 2 months with material from the general store, and it was by no means the work of a professional seamstress, but it was entirely hers. Clement wore a clean white shirt and his best coat, and looked at her walking toward him as though the building could have caught fire, and he would not have noticed. The preacher said the words that needed saying. Clement said "I do" with the deliberateness of a man who has always meant everything he has said, and means this most of all. Jane said "I do" with a calm, complete certainty that felt like nothing she had ever said before, including all of her very considerable history of meaning what she said. Clara Fenn cried. Deputy Reed shook Clement's hand with both of his. The celebration afterward in Mrs. Fenn's enlarged parlor was loud and warm and went on until well past the hour that propriety technically recommended, and no one minded. They moved into the ranch house together, which meant that Jane's books filled the shelves in the front room and her papers covered a corner of the kitchen table that Clement quietly left clear every morning after that, and the east-facing bedroom caught the morning light the way he had promised. She took on the role of teacher at Caldwell Springs formally in October, since Miss Abbott had made it clear she was planning to marry her beau from Missouri and return east by spring. Jane built the curriculum properly, introduced reading materials that had not been available before, and wrote to Philadelphia for additional texts, which she paid for partly from her teaching salary and partly from the legal settlement that had come with Thomas's land claim. She kept Thomas's land. She did not sell it. She had it worked by one of the homesteader families who needed the acreage, and they worked it well, and she visited it sometimes and felt Thomas in the cottonwoods and the creek sound, and the particular quality of light that he had described, and that turned out to be exactly as he had said. The state investigation into the circumstances of Thomas's death concluded in November of 1879. The formal finding was that the fence-cutting had been deliberate and orchestrated by Harlan Dusk's foreman, Cutter, who had also, the investigation found, been present on the land that night, and whose actions had created conditions that led directly to Thomas's death. Cutter received an additional sentence. The state's report acknowledged, in formal language, that Thomas Covington had died as a direct consequence of an organized pattern of criminal coercion, and that the legal system had failed to prevent it. It was not, Jane understood, the full justice she had wanted. It was not Thomas alive and well and writing her letters about the sky, but it was a formal accounting, on the record, that said his death was not an accident and that the people responsible had been named. It was something. She wrote it all in a letter and folded it and walked out to Thomas's creek and said what she needed to say to the water and the cottonwoods and the late November sky. Clement walked with her, as he had walked with her from the beginning, near enough and quiet enough to make the walking possible. Coming home from the creek that evening, Jane stopped in the lane and looked at the ranch house with its lit windows and the smoke from the kitchen chimney and the horses in the corral and all the ordinary, extraordinary fact of the life she had built here, and she said to Clement, who was walking beside her, he would have loved this. He did love this, Clement said. He loved this country. He wrote about it the way a person writes about something they know they are right to love. He was right, Jane said. Yes, Clement said, and so were you to come. She took his arm and they walked in, and the light was warm through the windows. In the spring of 1880, Jane understood that she was expecting a child. She told Clement on a quiet Sunday morning at the kitchen table over coffee, simply and directly, in the way that she did most things, and he was quiet for a moment in which she watched something move through him that was the complicated alloy of joy and the specific fear that accompanies joy when you have a history of loss. Then he put his hand over hers and said, "Good," and she laughed at the completeness of it, and he smiled, and then he said it again, "Good," with more feeling, and that was that. Their son was born in November of 1880, which was a Wednesday, and he arrived into the world with remarkable confidence and volume, and he was healthy and substantial, and had, from the first moment, a quality of attention in his expression that Jane recognized from both his father and, she thought privately, from Thomas, who had written about the world around him with exactly that kind of careful noticing. They named him Thomas James Bailey. The James was for Clement's father, who had been a difficult man but a real one, and the Thomas needed no explanation. Clara Finn held him at 3 hours old and said he was the finest baby she had seen in 20 years, and that Clara was a reasonable and accurate judge of babies. Life on the frontier in those years was not, in any sense, uncomplicated. The winters were hard and the work was constant, and the uncertainty of weather and market, and all the other forces that shaped the life of a ranching family in Kansas in the early 1880s was genuinely demanding. Jane managed the household accounts with the precision she applied to everything, taught school with the devotion she had always brought to teaching, and was awake to the way her community was changing and what it needed. She was involved in the effort to establish a proper library for Caldwell Springs, writing to Philadelphia and to the State Library Association, and eventually to Andrew Carnegie's fund, which was in the early stages of what would become a much larger library initiative, and securing a modest grant for a collection of books that arrived in crates in the spring of 1882, and were installed in a room that the town had renovated for the purpose, with collective labor and considerable discussion about which wall the shelves should go on. Clement watched this process with the expression he wore when he was deeply proud of something and did not intend to be obvious about it, and Jane caught him in it once and told him to go ahead and be obvious if he liked, and he said that he was fine either way. Their daughter arrived in 1883, in March, which was a Sunday, and she came as confidently as her brother had, which Jane had come to suspect was simply the character of children born to confident people. She had dark eyes that were exactly Clement's, and a disposition that Clara Finn immediately described as formidable, which Clara said with great satisfaction. They named her Alina Ruth Bailey, the Ruth being Jane's mother's name, and she grew into the formidable description with impressive thoroughness. Young Thomas at 3 was deeply interested in everything that moved, including horses, cattle, the dog, insects, and the clouds, and he narrated his observations to whoever was available, which was a quality that both his parents recognized and neither of them could reasonably object to. The investigation's aftermath continued to work through the system in ways that Jane tracked carefully. A second homesteader who had been coerced into selling under dusk received restitution in 1881. The land records were corrected formally in 1882. Dusk remained in the state penitentiary, and Cutter's sentence was upheld on appeal. The formal record of what had happened to Thomas Covington remained on record, accessible to anyone who cared to look. Jane continued to care and to look and to make sure others could. In the summer of 1884, a young woman arrived in Caldwell Springs on the stagecoach from Abilene, carrying a carpet bag and a purposeful expression, and she walked into Jane's schoolroom and said that she had heard there was a school teacher here who might help her, that she was looking for work and a way forward, and that she had come a long way. She was from Missouri and her name was Ada Drummond, and she was 20 years old and scared in a way that she was managing very well. Jane gave her a cup of tea and listened to her, and then she found her lodging with Clara Finn and spent the next week helping her establish herself, and Clement, hearing Jane describe it in the evening, recognized something in the account that made him smile. "You are running a rescue operation," he said. "I am being a neighbor," Jane said. "It is the same thing," he said. "You told me that once." She had. She had said it to him in their first week, when he said she was making herself part of the town, and she said she was making herself useful. He had told her that in this country they were the same thing, and she had believed him, and she had spent the years since understanding more fully what that meant. Ada Drummond stayed. She became the Caldwell Springs schoolteacher when Jane's expanding responsibilities made it necessary to share the role. She was good at it, naturally and instinctively, and the children adored her with the irrational completeness that children bring to the right teacher. The years moved the way years do when they are full. There was hard weather and good seasons, and the slow accretion of a life, built deliberately by two people who understood what they were building and why. There were losses, because the frontier did not leave anything untouched. Clement lost 2 horses to a fever in the winter of 1882 that cost him significantly and set the ranch back for a season. A family 2 miles north lost their barn and one of their children to a lightning fire in the summer of 1883, and the community pulled together the way communities do in those circumstances, with the kind of practical solidarity that requires no philosophy but enacts it thoroughly. Young Thomas Bailey grew into a boy who was, his father said, going to be either a naturalist or a lawyer, because he argued the case for every creature he found in the yard and expected the argument to succeed. Eleanor Bailey grew into a girl who was, her mother said, going to be whatever she decided she was going to be, and that this was the correct approach to the question. Both of them were taught to read early and read widely and ask questions and expect answers, and both of them spent time in their mother's schoolroom and on their father's ranch, and were consequently children of both the mind and the land. In 1885, Jane completed the written account she had been working on, in the hours between school and supper, and after the children were in bed, for the better part of 2 years. It was a formal account of the land fraud in Caldwell Springs, the methods used by Harlan Dusk and those like him, the failures of local systems to protect vulnerable homesteaders, and the means by which those systems had eventually been corrected. It was not written for publication, exactly, though she did not rule that out. It was written because she was a teacher, and she believed that documented truth was its own form of protection. She sent a copy to the state attorney's office. She sent a copy to the county courthouse. She sent a copy to the land office in Wichita. She sent a copy to her contact in Philadelphia who worked in journalism and who was, she knew, the kind of person who understood the value of accurate records. Clement read it and was quiet for a long time. "It is very good," he said finally. "It is accurate," she said. "Good is secondary." "Both," he said. "It is both." She put Thomas's name on the dedication page, not in a dramatic way, simply for Thomas Covington, who documented what he saw and was right to. Clement put his arm around her when she showed him that page, and she leaned into him, and they were quiet together for a moment with all of it. Their second son arrived in the spring of 1886. He was born on an April morning when the plains were doing the thing they did in spring, coming alive in a green so vivid it looked painted, and he was healthy and loud and had, from the start, his mother's gray eyes and his father's quality of complete attention. They named him William Henry Bailey, the William for no one in particular and the Henry because both of them liked it, which Clara Fenn said was perfectly sufficient reason for a name. Clara Fenn, at this point in the story, was 62 years old and showed no signs of slowing down, and continued to maintain that babies and bread and a well-run boarding house were the 3 most dependable things in the world, a philosophy that Jane had come to appreciate deeply. Caldwell Springs in 1886 was a different town from the one Jane had stepped off a stagecoach into in 1878. It had a proper hotel now. It had a library with 340 books, which Jane had counted personally. It had a school with 2 teachers. It had a sheriff who was honest and competent. It had the complicated, imperfect, real character of a community that has been tested and has built something afterward, not a perfect something, but an honest one. It had still all the difficulties inherent in being a small frontier town in an era of rapid and not always just change. The question of the relationship between the territory's settlers and the indigenous nations, whose land this had been, was not resolved, and could not be resolved by the good intentions of individual ranchers like Clement, who had always conducted his relationships across those lines with respect and would continue to do so. Jane wrote about this too, carefully and without claiming an authority she did not have, but with the understanding that the truth about a place included all of its truth, not the convenient parts. On an evening in September of 1887, which was nearly 10 years exactly from Thomas's death, Jane and Clement sat on the ranch house porch after supper while the children were inside with the noise and the particular domestic weather of 3 children under 10. The sky was doing the thing. It was always doing the thing. She had learned in 9 years on the plains that the sky here was not a backdrop but a presence, something that participated in everything below it with complete indifferent authority. Clement said after a while, "Are you happy?" It was not a question he asked often. He was not a man who asked things he already knew the answer to, and usually he seemed to know. She looked at him and understood that he was asking with full sincerity and that it mattered to him to hear it said. "Yes," she said. "Entirely." He looked at her with the particular quality of his attention that had been there from the first day and had not diminished in 9 years, which she had understood at some point was simply how he looked at things he valued, with his whole consideration and without reservation. "Good," he said, in the same way he had said it when she told him about Thomas. She laughed. "You have used that word to cover an enormous range of circumstances," she said. "It is a very sufficient word," he said. She looked out at the plains in the evening light. The grass moved in the wind the way it always moved, like something breathing, like something alive in the old way that did not require an observer but simply was. She had thought when she first arrived that the beauty of this land was a rougher, rawer thing than she had been prepared for. She had been right, and she had also been wrong about what that meant, because the rawness was not a lack. It was a kind of abundance that did not soften itself for anyone's comfort, and she had come to love that specifically. He was right, she said. Clement knew who she meant without being told. He was, Clement said. I did come to the right country, she said. The words had circled all the way around now, back to where they had started, in a letter from a man she hadn't met yet, written to a woman who had not yet packed her courage into a carpet bag and set out across the country to claim what was hers. The courage and the country had found each other in the end, the way certain things do, with a rightness that was not sentimental but was simply true. Inside the house, Thomas said something loud, and Alina replied with something firm, and William contributed something that was probably not words yet, but was full of conviction, and the ordinary, extraordinary music of it came through the door into the evening air. Clement put his hand over Jane's where it rested on the porch rail. She turned her hand and held his. The sky was incandescent and vast and permanent, the way the best things are, and the wind moved through the grass all the way to the horizon, and Caldwell Springs was lit with its small, persistent lights below them, and the ranch house was warm behind them, and everything that had been broken had been made into something, if not unbroken then remade into a shape that held, which is perhaps the more honest form of repair. Jane Covington Bailey, who had come to the frontier wearing her courage like a second skin, looked out at the country she had come to, and found that it had become, without her quite noticing the exact moment of the transition, home.